In 1962, a 19-year-old heroin addict named Howard Lotsof swallowed a dose of an obscure African psychedelic called Ibogaine. He wasn't trying to get clean. He was trying to get high. 36 hours later, he walked out of the experience with no withdrawal symptoms, no cravings, and no desire to use heroin again. Not reduced desire, zero desire. Lotsof spent the next 4 decades trying to bring Ibogaine to the world as a medical treatment. He filed patents, he funded studies, he begged the National Institute on Drug Abuse to investigate. For a brief window in the early 1990s, NIDA actually did, before abruptly pulling the funding and walking away. Today, Ibogaine remains a Schedule I controlled substance in the United States, classified alongside heroin itself, the very drug it appears to cure. It is legal and used therapeutically in dozens of countries, but in America, the molecule that may represent the single most effective addiction interruption tool ever discovered sits behind the same legal wall as the substances destroying millions of lives. This is the story of Ibogaine, where it comes from, what it does to the brain, and why the most promising addiction treatment of the last century was buried. Ibogaine comes from the root bark of Tabernanthe iboga, a small shrub native to the rainforests of Central Africa, primarily Gabon, Cameroon, and the Republic of Congo. For the Bwiti people of Gabon, iboga is not a drug. It is the central sacrament of their spiritual tradition, a practice that predates European contact by centuries, possibly millennia. The Bwiti call it the wood that speaks. The most important use of iboga occurs during initiation, a rite of passage that every member of the Bwiti community undergoes, typically in adolescence or early adulthood. The initiate consumes massive doses of scraped iboga root bark over a period of 12 to 24 hours, far more than what is used in clinical addiction treatment. The purpose is not recreation, it is death and rebirth. The initiate enters a visionary state that the Bwiti describe as traveling to the land of the ancestors. They report encountering deceased relatives, spirit beings, and what many describe as the source of creation itself. The experience typically lasts between 24 and 48 hours, making it one of the longest psychedelic experiences known. During this time, the initiate lies motionless, attended by experienced practitioners called nganga, who monitor their physical state and guide them through the journey with music, chanting, and the sound of the mogongo, a mouth harp considered the voice of iboga itself. What the initiate returns with is not merely a memory or a vision. The Bwiti say they return having seen their own life from outside, every choice, every consequence, every relationship, laid bare without the usual defenses of the ego. They come back knowing who they are. This is worth pausing on, because when Western researchers began studying Ibogaine's effects on addiction, the psychological component they documented was almost identical to what the Bwiti have described for generations: a total life review, an encounter with suppressed memories and emotions, and a fundamental restructuring of self-understanding. The science would eventually catch up to what the Bwiti already knew. Here is where Ibogaine becomes genuinely unprecedented in pharmacology. Most psychedelics interact primarily with serotonin receptors, specifically the 5-HT2A receptor. Ibogaine does this too, but it also does something no other known psychedelic does. Ibogaine acts on multiple neurotransmitter systems simultaneously. It binds to opioid receptors, mu, kappa, and delta, which is why it directly interrupts opioid withdrawal. It modulates the dopamine transporter, affecting the reward pathways that drive compulsive drug-seeking behavior. It interacts with NMDA glutamate receptors, the same system involved in memory formation and neural plasticity. And it acts on nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, which may explain anecdotal reports of people spontaneously quitting cigarettes after treatment. No other single molecule in pharmacology hits this many addiction-relevant systems at once. But the mechanism that truly sets Ibogaine apart involves a metabolite called noribogaine. After ingestion, the liver converts Ibogaine into noribogaine, which has a much longer half-life, remaining active in the body for days to weeks after the Ibogaine itself has been metabolized. Noribogaine acts as a sustained-release anti-addictive agent. It continues to occupy opioid receptors at a low level, preventing withdrawal and cravings long after the acute psychedelic experience has ended. This is why many patients report that the window of clarity after Ibogaine treatment lasts not hours but weeks or months, a pharmacological runway for building new patterns before the old neurochemistry reasserts itself. There is also emerging evidence that Ibogaine promotes the expression of glial cell line-derived neurotrophic factor, GDNF, a protein that supports the survival and regeneration of dopaminergic neurons. In animal studies, GDNF upregulation has been shown to reverse some of the neurological damage caused by chronic drug use. Put simply, Ibogaine does not just interrupt addiction at the level of craving. It appears to repair some of the brain damage that addiction causes. And then there is the subjective experience itself, the 20 to 36-hour visionary journey that researchers divide into 3 phases. The first is the acute visionary phase, lasting 4 to 8 hours, characterized by intense closed-eye imagery and the panoramic life review the Bwiti describe. The second is an evaluative phase, where patients process what they have seen and integrate insights about their behavior patterns. The third is a residual stimulation phase that can last 24 to 72 hours, during which patients feel alert, reflective, and often profoundly changed. The clinical data from this dual mechanism, neurochemical reset plus psychological breakthrough, is striking. A 2014 study published in the American Journal of Drug and Alcohol Abuse found that a single Ibogaine treatment reduced opioid withdrawal scores by 50% or more within 24 hours. A 2017 observational study in Brazil followed participants for 12 months and found that 72% remained completely free of their primary substance of abuse. A 2023 study from Stanford, published in Nature Medicine, examined veterans treated with Ibogaine for traumatic brain injury and PTSD and found significant improvements in cognition, mood, and PTSD symptoms, benefits that persisted at least 1 month post-treatment. So why is this molecule illegal? The story begins with Howard Lotsof and his accidental discovery in 1962. After recognizing what had happened to him, Lotsof spent decades advocating for Ibogaine research. In 1985, he was awarded a U.S. patent for Ibogaine as a method for treating opioid withdrawal, the first of several patents he would hold. By the early 1990s, his advocacy had attracted the attention of NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Under pressure from activists and researchers, NIDA convened a review and authorized a series of preclinical studies. The results were promising. Animal studies showed dramatic reductions in self-administration of morphine, cocaine, and alcohol. Then, in 1993, a woman named Yvette Zolich died during an unsupervised Ibogaine treatment in the Netherlands. The cause was likely a cardiac arrhythmia. Ibogaine can prolong the QT interval, a measure of heart rhythm, which in vulnerable individuals can trigger fatal cardiac events. This is a real risk. Ibogaine is not pharmacologically safe for everyone. Patients with pre-existing heart conditions, those on certain medications, and those who do not receive proper medical screening face genuine danger. Several dozen deaths have been documented in unregulated settings over the past 3 decades. But what happened next was not a measured response to a manageable risk. NIDA pulled its funding entirely. The FDA never approved clinical trials. And in 1970, Ibogaine had already been placed on Schedule 1, defined as having no accepted medical use and high potential for abuse, despite the fact that Ibogaine is not addictive, not recreational, and produces an experience so physically demanding that virtually no one seeks to repeat it for pleasure. The scheduling was part of a broad sweep that also captured psilocybin, LSD, and mescaline under the Controlled Substances Act. But while those substances have since benefited from a renaissance of clinical research, psilocybin is now in Phase 3 FDA trials for depression, Ibogaine has been largely left behind. The reason is not scientific. It is economic. Ibogaine is a naturally occurring compound that cannot be patented. A single treatment costs between $2,000 and $8,000 at overseas clinics. Methadone maintenance, the current standard of care, costs approximately $6,500 per patient per year, prescribed indefinitely. Suboxone, the other frontline medication, generates billions in annual revenue for its manufacturer. A one-time treatment that eliminates the need for ongoing medication is not a product the pharmaceutical industry has any incentive to develop. And without industry funding and with federal research dollars withdrawn, Ibogaine fell into a regulatory dead zone, too promising to ignore, too inconvenient to support. Meanwhile, the addiction crisis deepened. Over 100,000 Americans now die from drug overdoses every year. The opioid epidemic alone has killed more than 500,000 people since 1999. And a molecule that peer-reviewed research suggests could interrupt this cycle in a single dose remains federally banned. If this changed how you think about addiction, consciousness, or suppressed science, consider what else has been hidden in plain sight. Our video on DMT, the psychedelic your brain already produces, explores the same frontier from the inside out. And our deep dive into the Emerald Tablet reveals why the ancients said, "As above, so below," and what modern science is finally confirming. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. What do you think? Should Ibogaine be legalized for addiction treatment? Tell us in the comments.